So we know that we can help kind of protect our resources by, one, not using as much, reusing the ones we do use, and recycling those that are kind of past their use. But in general, how are we protecting our resources? How are we making sure that not all forests are being cut down and not all fish are being fished? And our government actually plays a really large role in that. So in the United States, there is a lot of federal land that has some sort of resource protection. If you take a look at this map, you can see a lot of that is out west, in a lot of areas that really just aren't desirable. They're usually mountainous regions or deserts, so areas that we can't really use anyway. Not to say that's what all of our federal land is, but a good proportion of it out west is exactly that. But there's federal lands everywhere. These federal lands range from national parks to national forests, even national monuments. Now, before I talk about the different organizations, I kind of want to give you a brief background in our government. So hopefully you know that there are three branches of our government: the legislative, executive, and judicial branch. And all of these have many different subcategories. In the executive branch, there are tons of different departments. You've heard of these departments before, such as the Department of Energy, Department of Justice, Department of Transportation. Some of these departments are responsible for our federal lands. The three major departments that we'll talk about are the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Commerce, and the Department of the Interior. These are the major ones that are protecting the lands of the United States. On this slide, I show you the seals of two of those organizations, the Department of the Interior, which protects a majority of our land. About 75% of all federal land is managed by the Department of the Interior. The rest of that land, about 25% of it, is protected by the Department of Agriculture. Now, I mentioned the Department of Commerce as well. They actually oversee our aquatic resources. So I'll talk about those more in the next couple of slides. But when it comes to physical land, it's mainly DOI, the Department of the Interior, and the DOA, the Department of Agriculture. So we'll talk about the Department of the Interior first, since they regulate the majority of land. One of the organizations within the Department of the Interior is the National Park Service, which hopefully you've heard of at some point. There are tons of different national parks in the United States. The first and probably one of the most famous ones is Yellowstone National Park, which is out in Wyoming. But all of our national parks are maintained in this department. Now, the thing about national parks is they're kept in pristine condition. Their goal for the national park system is first and foremost education. They want to teach people about these natural environments. They don't allow people to take resources. You very rarely are allowed to fish in a national park. You can't extract coal or minerals or chop down trees. Their goal is to keep the park as near to pristine condition as possible. But the National Park Service also wants to attract visitors. They create different trails in order to take people through the park and teach them about these really awesome natural wonders. The National Park Service not only includes the famous national parks that you've heard of, but also include the National Seashore Program. Assateague Island here on the coast of Maryland is a national seashore. Also, the monuments in Washington, D.C., those are actually all part of the National Park Service as well. Here in Maryland, we have a lot of historic battlefields, as well as the Blue Ridge Parkway, that are all part of the National Park Service. Another system that we have in the Department of the Interior is the National Wildlife Refuge System. This system is actually part of the Fish and Wildlife Service. The Fish and Wildlife Service, again, part of the Department of the Interior. These systems, you are allowed to hunt in them, you are allowed to fish in them, but they're managed for that. So heavily regulated. They'll let you know how many you're allowed to catch, what size, what time of year. They really want to maintain those ecosystems. They really want to maintain that sustainable yield. They, ask hunters to come in order to maintain populations, but again, kind of extending this service, this natural service to people. If people can get passionate about this wildlife refuge, they're more likely to protect it. Although you can hunt and fish in these systems, you still can't do any kind of resource extraction. So they don't let loggers come in or miners come in to take any resources that might be in that wildlife refuge. Their main goal, similar to the national park system, is education. How can we teach people about what's happening here? And more importantly, why is it important? Why should you protect this area? And so they're trying to make that connection between humans and nature. Now, these guys will alter the environment a little bit, but in a positive way. They will remove invasive species, so species that were accidentally brought into the park or into the area. They'll also do controlled burns, so if it's getting a whole bunch of brush or leaf litter, they will actually burn the forest, but in a very controlled manner. National Park System does not do this. National Park System essentially says, this is how it is, this is how it'll be. The Wildlife Refuge System is really trying to maintain the original habitat that organisms once saw. The last organization under the Department of the Interior is the Bureau of Land Management. They manage a majority of all federal land, over 40% of federal land, and this is mainly the land that's out west. This land you are allowed to sell, or the federal government sell. It sells the rights to any kind of resources such as, gold or any kind of ore, oil, natural gas. The government more or less says, we own this land, but we'll let you use it. They'll also let ranchers use it for grazing. So this land, although it's managed, it's not managed really for resource protection. They do have a lot of regulations. If you're going to take gold, here's some rules that you need to follow, but their main goal isn't to keep the land pristine. You may have heard of some of these. They'll sometimes be designated as a wilderness area or scenic rivers or scenic trails. So they are owned by the government, but again, there's not too much conservation going on. There's some management of it, more management than, say, if this was someone's backyard, but not nearly so as a wildlife refuge or a national park. So that was all within the Department of the Interior. The Department of Agriculture has the Forest Service. The Forest Service allows for different extractions, whether you're talking about minerals or even talking about animals, such as hunting or fishing. However, those are much, much more regulated than the Bureau of Land Management. Think of the Bureau of Land Management as the government saying, hey, we own this land, but we want to make money off of it. The Forest Service says, hey, we own this land, we want to make money off of it, but our first goal is to make sure this ecosystem stays in good health. We're not just going to get rid of it, just say, we don't want it anymore. The main goal is to keep it in good health. They will put out fires, they do different surveys of the land to make sure that it's healthy. They also maintain a lot of recreation, so there's usually a lot of trails through a lot of the Forest Service managed lands. So again, you can take resources, both mineral resources, timber resources, as well as organisms, but their main goal is to make sure these ecosystems stay intact. Now, I mentioned before, we also had the Department of Commerce. Now, Commerce is a very large department looking at all sorts of things, but there's this one little organization within the Department of Commerce, NOAA. NOAA stands for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They provide a lot of really good weather reports. That's what they mainly follow, but they also do a lot of aquatic research. They are the ones that are responsible for any kind of aquatic preserve, We don't have as many protected areas in our oceans as we do, say, on land, but the ones that we do have are protected and regulated by NOAA. Their goals are both protection and restoration, so trying to fix coral reefs, trying to reintroduce various species, create seabed grasses again. They also manage fishing permits, so making sure that you're taking the right amount of fish, the right size of fish, establishing those seasons, and estimating population sizes. NOAA is also a huge research organization. If any of you are interested in marine biology or oceanography, NOAA is an incredible organization that does a lot of research. They do a lot of research on the Chesapeake Bay, as well as coral reefs here on the East Coast. So this image is just trying to help kind of keep everything together. So again, the Department of Agriculture has the Forest Service. The Department of the Interior, which regulates the most amount of land, has the Fish and Wildlife Service, which regulates the National Wildlife Refuge System. They also have the National Park Service. And then our Department of Commerce has the organization NOAA. So although you and I can do a lot in order to protect our resources, or at least try not to waste as many resources, our government is working to protect resources too. And it's by you and me urging our government to protect more land that gets things done.